Welcome to the inaugural episode 0 of the Royal Palace Podcast, the podcast where we explain French law and politics to Americans. I'm Liam, and this is my co-host Patrick.
Hey, everybody.
We're two Americans who have both lived significant parts of our adult lives in France, and we are making this episode to explain France, how it works, how its politics works, how its law works, especially, to Americans. And our proper first episode will be coming out next week, which is an introduction to French political institutions, French legal institutions, French history, and everything you've ever wanted to know about France. But we've decided to jump ahead and make an episode this week to be released before our first episode in light of the French election that happened on Sunday, and which everyone's talking about, even in the US, because it was an election where the far right, the Rassemblement National, or I have no idea how you translate Rassemblement, but
the National Rally.
National Rally, is that how they translate it? Well, Marine Le Pen's party, I'm sure you've heard of it. This has been making a lot of news in the US. And there's a second round of this election coming up next Sunday. So we are aware that people in the US do not understand how this works, don't know what's going on in France, don't know what's going on anywhere generally besides the US, because that's how we are as Americans. We only think about ourselves. And we can say that because we're Americans too. But we wanted to talk to you today about what this election means, how it works, and maybe give a little prediction on what we think is going to happen on Sunday.
So perhaps it's best to start off with who's the president of France. Most of you probably know it's a man named Emmanuel Macron, sometimes pronounced Macaroon.
As the correct pronunciation.
He is in his second term, which came after his first term, in which his party had a majority in the parliament. However, since his second term, he only enjoyed a relative majority in the parliament, which has essentially submitted his political project to perhaps more political scrutiny than in his first term. And then on June 9th, we received the results of the European elections. Those of you who don't know, the European Union has quite the political apparatus, which includes a parliament based in Strasbourg. And the French European voter voted in large part for the National Rally, or allies of the National Rally, giving essentially a right-wing victory in terms of France's European representatives. This led Emmanuel Macron to declare the dissolution the very same day of the National Assembly, which essentially means that new elections will be held. All the current deputies go home, and new elections are held, typically in the hope of establishing a new political consensus that in the eyes of the president, will back his project.
So to back up even further, let's talk a bit about who Macron is, who Marine Le Pen is, and generally what has led us to the current point in French politics. So French politics has, for most of the past few decades, been dominated, like most European countries, by a center-left social democratic party, the Socialist Party, and center-right parties, which have gone through various iterations in France, and there's also various strains of center-right movements in France, from Gaullists to non-Gaullists. That's something we'll certainly talk a lot about on future episodes of this podcast. But the important thing is that, for now, is that France has historically been, in much the same way as Germany or England, dominated by two major parties, which frankly differed only slightly in what they believed in. And that has been breaking down in France. Again, something that's common across Europe. In the past decade, this really maybe started, you could say, in the 2002 French presidential election, which is when, so French presidential elections have a two-round system where you have a bunch of candidates in the first round, and then the top two candidates go on to a second round. We talk more about how that works in our episode 1. But basically what happened in 2002 was that the incumbent center-right president, Jacques Chirac, was pitted largely due to the left being divided among several candidates in the second round against a man named Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of what was then called the National Front and is now called the National Rally, which was a far-right party. And this sent shockwaves through France and Europe because it was a far-right party having one of the two major candidates in the French presidential election. This was unprecedented. However, Chirac absolutely trounced Jean-Marie Le Pen in the second round. Also, Jean-Marie Le Pen had a history of Holocaust denial. That was another reason it was controversial. But in the second round, Jacques Chirac absolutely trounced him, winning almost 80% of the vote. Since then, things have been changing. Back then, everyone felt safe. Oh, the far right, they're never going to come into power. It's only a small minority of people who are racist and anti-Muslim and so on. But especially since Jean-Marie Le Pen's daughter, Marine Le Pen, took over the party a few years later, the party has been growing steadily. She initially made the party much more moderate, or at least give a more moderate face. Her father was sort of a red-faced, blustering, often openly anti-Semitic. And Marine Le Pen put all that behind them, at least on paper, saying that no, they're just good French citizens concerned about immigration. And this all really came to a head at the presidential election in 2017, which was really the year that the French political system broke down completely. You had, for the first time in I don't know how long, but certainly a long time, neither the Socialist Party or one of the iterations of the center-right party had a candidate in the second round of the presidential election. Instead, you had Emmanuel Macron, who founded a new party that was then called En Marche, which means a bad translation that I like would be walking. But yeah, on the move, I guess.
That's what the international press calls it, at least.
Yeah, sounds even worse in English. It's no longer called that because he's renamed it like 10 times. It's now called, at least I heard, Renaissance. I don't know if he's renamed it since, but...
Yeah, but the presidential majority now calls themselves Together, Ensemble.
Yeah, right. God, yeah. He keeps renaming it. It almost doesn't matter because it's Macron's party. That's the point. It's his party.
Typically in the media, they'll refer to this as the presidential majority.
Yeah, because no one can remember what he calls it because he keeps changing it. But so Emmanuel Macron is someone who comes from the Socialist Party, from the center-left Socialist Party. He was a minister under the last socialist president, who was François Hollande, who was president from 2012 to 2017. Yeah, that's a whole other story, François Hollande. We'll talk about that at some point too. We'll talk about everything. But so yeah, Emmanuel Macron comes from that sort of quote-unquote center-left tradition. But the thing is, again, like in most European countries, the center-left party at that point was no longer had anything remotely resembling left in it, right? They again, as in Germany, as in England, sort of moved to the right over the course of the early the 90s and early 2000s to the point where it's difficult to distinguish them from the right-wing party. And you generally had this situation.
At least from the Conservative Party, right?
Yeah, I mean, right, exactly. Not from the far right. I mean, they're socially liberal and so on, but they just gone are the days where the Socialist Party, which again is called the Socialist Party, it was founded by Jean Jaurès, I think. Anyway, pretty sure it was founded by Jean Jaurès. Whatever. It has a long, proud tradition that has it really threw by the wayside and stomped all over in the past couple decades, and that is part of a big part of the reason why, come 2017, everyone's sort of disgusted with the whole political establishment and both parties, because you just had a socialist party president, François Hollande, who everyone hated and was terrible. Immediately after, a right-wing president, Sarkozy, who also everyone hated and was terrible and was corrupt. So you had this disgust with the establishment, and that's when Macron broke in. He was a relatively insignificant Socialist Party figure, a junior minister, and he comes in and he says, enough of this left versus right garbage. Let's do something new. You've heard this phrase before, neither left nor right. But that was his whole thing, the radical center, modernizing France, getting rid of the red tape, getting rid of digitizing everything. making it the startup nation. Startup nation. That's actually something that he said over and over in his campaign in 2017.
Which, by the way, is inspired from Israel.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Exactly. It make France more like Israel. Sounds great. Yeah. So this is when Macron comes in, and this is actually really popular. I mean, we were both in France in 2017, and I remember many people I knew who are perfectly reasonable people and would never dream of voting for Macron today, being actually quite excited about him at the time, because there was this impression that France was sclerotic and full of red tape and blah blah blah, and that they needed to clean house, they needed to modernize, they needed to get some hip young people. Also, he was very young, and so he won. And in the second round, a big part of the reason why he won the second round was because in the second round he was against, for the first time since 2002, the far right, Marine Le Pen, again the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the candidate in 2002. And this time, Marine Le Pen did much better. She got a third of the vote, still defeated by 2/3 by Macron. But this was considered shocking, and also a lot of people voted for Macron just because they really hated the far right and what the National Front represented.
It's important to note that the political establishment organized around this idea that even if you don't like Emmanuel Macron, and they'll do this even more in the following election, it's sort of a civic duty to prevent the far right from gaining power. And I'm sure this will ring home to our American listeners who are faced with a similar situation come this November.
Right, bit of a Trump Biden situation for sure. Like the same line is like, oh, what are you going to do? Okay, sure, Biden's not perfect. Maybe you don't like anything about him, but if you don't vote for him, Trump's going to win. And they did a sort of similar fear-mongering thing. They had this phrase they kept saying in French, faire barrage, just like block, I guess, like block off, impede, vote for me even if you don't like me. I'm better than them. And the thing is that, let's fast forward 7 years. An increasing amount of French people no longer feel that Macron is actually better than Le Pen. So in the 2022 election, which was a repeat of Macron versus Le Pen, that another thing we can identify with in the US is having two elections in a row with two candidates that everyone hates. And in that one, the scores were dramatically different. Macron still won, but this time he only got a bit over 58% of the vote. And Le Pen got nearly 42% of the vote. And again, this was shocking. And that's when there's only two choices again. There's no other right-wing options. There's no left-wing options. But that brings us to what happened on June 9th, which was the European parliamentary elections, when the far right did really well, especially in France. And that brings us to Macron calling the elections. So why would you say Macron decided to call elections at this point? Because to be clear, he didn't have to. His term, both his term and the term of the parliament last 2 more years. But under the French system, as is common in many European countries, the president can choose to dissolve the parliament at any time and call new elections, unlike in the US.
In episode 1, we get into how this actually works from a legal perspective. But for now, I think it's just worth understanding that the faculty of the president to dissolve the parliament can serve as a way of sort of reaffirming the democratic mandate that the parliament and the president have. So famously, Charles de Gaulle would use this faculty to essentially consolidate his rule over the country. And it's perfectly imaginable that someone like Emmanuel Macron would try and do the same thing if he believed that the results of this election would back him and his party and his political project.
Why he believed that is unclear. No one seems to know.
This is precisely the issue, which is that almost in a Gaullist sort of tradition, kind of says to the French people, like, it's time for you to, given the results of the European election, to really think about this and come back and back my government. But as Liam alludes to, it's kind of unclear why he would imagine this, because the European elections are very much a sign that people are trying to vote far right.
Right. In the European elections, the far right came first. Now, there is a history of European elections generally favoring um, far right and Eurosceptic parties more, just because, well, Le Pen's not that Eurosceptic, but it's still like European elections tend to mobilize people around being against Europe. Um, because like a lot of people just don't vote in them. So that's generally been a trend. So it was fair to like see the European election result and think, okay, probably the parliamentary election wouldn't be that bad, but
Yeah, and
still,
it's also fair to say that the elected assembly that Macron had prior to his choice to dissolve the assembly was largely seen as undemocratic, since I believe only 39% of electors voted in that election. And indeed, last weekend's election showed, I believe, around 69% of voters showed up. So indeed, last week's election or last Sunday's election was more democratic. Certainly, this
yeah.
assembly will have a much stronger democratic mandate.
Also, people sort of vote for whoever they feel like in the European elections because no one really has the impression it matters. That's something we'll talk about. All that European stuff that is definitely coming in a future episode. But another thing I saw, one speculation I saw for why Macron decided to do this is that it worked, basically doing the same thing for Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, who's last year. Pedro Sanchez is from the center left party in Spain, the Socialist Party, and he has a very unstable coalition with a bunch of different small parties, and everyone felt like, and the far right's been growing and growing in Spain, and everyone felt like it was only a matter of time until he lost to the far right, and that all he'd do is like try to cling on to power until the last possible moment, and that was all he could do. And then last summer, he unexpectedly decided to call a snap election. Everyone thought he was crazy, and that the far right would win. And it actually worked, and retained his majority. So maybe he was looking at that.
I think the big difference, though, between Pedro Sanchez and Emmanuel Macron is Pedro Sanchez, he doesn't always live up to what people want from him, but he has a political project that has mass backing.
Right. And a lot of people like him. And he's also not like opposed from every direction in the way that Macron is. Macron is not just opposed from the far right, he's also opposed from the left and to some extent from the center right, although the center right has backed him in a lot of the previous parliaments.
However, it's worth noting that the actual state of the center right in France is chaotic, to say the least.
Well, that's something we can talk about now, is what happened in the actual election. So first of all, the important thing here is the election happened last Sunday on the 30th of June, sorry. And he announced the election right after the European Parliament election on the 9th of June. So that is an extraordinarily short election period. I mean, that's, especially given in the US, we're used to election periods lasting almost 2 years. Imagine them lasting like a little more than 2 weeks. And this was absolute chaos. And I do think that's probably part of what he was thinking, is like the opposition is so divided that nobody's going to be able to get a grip on things fast enough. Especially he was probably thinking of the left.
Right, because leading up to this election, the left was around what they called the NUPES, NUPEES. Essentially, it was a very weak coalition of the party called LFI, which is...
I've seen it translated France Unbowed. So that's France Unbowed. I know it does sound silly, but there's no really good way to translate it. But it's the France Insoumise, if people are familiar with a little bit of French, the France Insoumise, which is currently the major left-wing party in France.
The socialists?
Yeah, the historic major left-wing party, who are currently reduced to a tiny fraction of their former self. And the Greens and the Communist Party, also a shell of their former self.
And so in Parliament, this parliamentary grouping, struggled to have a coherent line. And certainly there were a lot of sort of internal conflicts between these different parties, which come from very different social constituencies.
Yeah.
That was not the case leading up into this election.
Yeah.
Instead, they created what they called the New Popular Front, which brings together these parties, but also the new anti-capitalist party, which is a very marginal party nonetheless, who has historically refused to team up with everyone else. And they presented a much more coherent, what would you call it, Liam?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely more consolidated, a better name. The NUP or NUPES, people couldn't even agree on how to pronounce that acronym for a long time. So uh, the Popular Front is much better. And they really, no one thought they're going to be able to do it. People on the left didn't think they're going to be able to pull it together because the last time around when they did that alliance, it took forever and it was constantly like, especially the communists and the socialists were kept being like, well, and I'm going to impose this ridiculous condition, etc. But they actually pulled it together quickly. But I think now's a good opportunity to talk about why it was so important or why these alliance forming things were so important, and also why the other alliance that we'll talk about in a minute was so important. And this has to do with the one of the weirdest electoral systems in the world. The National Assembly. This is something we don't talk about in episode 1, actually, because it's both oblique and it's also less important than how we talk more about the presidential election. But the elections to the lower house, the French Parliament, the National Assembly, are done on a very weird system. So, for context, there are in Europe, for the most part, two main systems of electing parliaments. One is what's called first past the post, and that is what everyone's familiar with in the US, and probably most people in the US think is sort of the only way to do elections, which is just like there's electoral districts, and there's candidates from different parties in those electoral districts, and whoever comes first is elected. In Europe, that's mainly only used by the UK. It's not actually even used in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament. They don't do that. It's used for like in England and other parts of Britain, and Ireland maybe. It's not super common. It's a very Anglo thing. Canada, the US, Australia, and the UK.
We love posts.
We love posts, and we love stupid electoral systems. Obviously the problem with that electoral system, well, there's no point getting into the details of the different electoral systems now, but that electoral system tends to favor only large parties. That's a big part of the reason we have a two-party system in the US, that and the enormous amount of money that's in politics. But it's just like, in England, for example, the Green Party every election gets millions of votes, but they have one seat. And they have one seat because those millions of votes are all like 10% of people voting for them all over the country. And that just gets you nothing in a first past the post system. You need to have a majority in at least some parts of the country. And that's why the only major third parties in England tend to be parties that are regionally strong, like the Scottish National Party or the Liberal Democrats, which are regionally strong in certain areas. And then the other one, which most countries in Europe use, is some form of proportional representation. This is pretty easy to explain, although it's kind of alien to Americans, which is that each party presents a list of their candidates, numbered from 1 on down to however many seats there are. And usually the first one is the leader of the party. And then in your district, which can be a whole country, if you're the Netherlands, for example, or it can be regional districts in Spain or in Germany, or state districts in Germany. But in each district, you have a list, and you vote for a party. And then let's say in your district that 20% of people voted for the Green Party. Well, then the Green Party, instead of getting nothing, as they would under the American system, gets 20% of the seats. So the seats are distributed proportionally. And instead of there being individual districts that people are elected in. Although in Germany, they also use a system where there are also districts. That's a whole other story. But those are basically the two systems that everyone uses. And then France uses a bizarre, it's not even a hybrid of the system. It's just I guess it's like a variation of first past the post. But it's a weird variation, right? So there's all these districts in France, just like in the US. But instead of the person who comes first in the district winning, it's significantly more complicated. Basically, if you win a majority in your district, and you also won a significant portion of the people who are actually registered to vote in that district, 25%. So you win. So that means that you both have to win a majority of the votes cast, and there also has to be a significant enough turnout for that to be 25% of the people registered to vote in that district. If that doesn't happen, let's say because there's multiple candidates, because no one gets a majority, if there's more than two candidates, in the U.S., if we had let's say one candidate gets 35% of the vote, there's another candidate gets 34, and there's another candidate gets 33, the guy who won 35% of the vote just wins. And in the German system, each of those parties would get the seats divided between them that were up for grabs. In the French system, you instead have a very complicated system of runoff voting. Runoff meaning there is a second round, and that's what's happening on Sunday.
So in probably the majority of districts, or as they call them in France, circumscriptions, there are runoff elections because the conditions that Liam laid out have not yet been met.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that people get elected directly. It does happen. Yeah, so in the case of there being a second round, which is the norm, maybe the most logical thing that would happen, and this is what happens in the presidential election, as I explained briefly before. This makes a lot of sense, right? If you had the vote split between more than two candidates, you just have two candidates left so that one of them has to get a majority and make everyone decide between those two. That is also what happens in usually the majority of districts in France. However, it doesn't have to happen because more than two candidates can qualify for the second round. So the requirement to qualify for the second round, if no one won a majority, is that you have 12.5% of people registered to vote in the district voting for you. So not just 12.5% of people of votes, but 12.5% of people who registered to vote. So this can very often lead to cases where there are three candidates. That's called a triangulaire, and that's quite common. And then you can have the rare thing where there's a quadrangulaire.
I believe there's one this time.
There were more. There was maybe 10 or something, but a lot of them have withdrawn. Which it's frankly it's very silly. The possibility of a quadrangulaire, or even a triangular, is why even have a second round if you've got three or four candidates in the second round? It doesn't make a ton of sense. But anyway, this sort of variation of first past the post is why it can lead to really weird results. Because it matters just so much. Like coming in second matters so much. For example, it's most of the country is going to be a choice this time and also in 2022 in the second round between the far right, the RN, and someone else. And as a result, being that someone else is the most important thing. And so if you have all the left parties running separately, you could get the situation where none of them were second because you have 30% far right, 20% Macron, and then all the left parties get 10%, even though there may be three or four different left parties. That is why it was so important this time and last time for the left parties to unite, because if they didn't unite, they would all be split up. And the way they unite is basically running agreements that only one of them will run in each district. So they divided up and been the France Insoumise, the France Unbowed gets this number of districts. The Green Party gets this number of districts to run in. And then no one else is running in the districts that one of our parties is running in. This time around, as we alluded to before, there was another agreement, which was very controversial and sort of blew up the center right.
So as we've alluded to already, there are two parties that are categorically on the right. Whether or not Macron's is or not is up for debate. But there's, as Liam has already said, the Rassemblement National, or the National Rally. And then there are LR, which is Les Républicains, or the Republicans.
And by the way, they did just name themselves after the American Party, the Republicans. Yeah. That is absolutely true, because they used to be called the UMP, right? Yes. The Union for a Popular Movement. And then they renamed themselves to sort of a rebranding that hasn't worked very well.
Yeah. Part of their thinking might have also been that the term Republican is used as a good thing in France and doesn't necessarily allude to a conservative political project.
I mean, this is something we talked a bit about in episode 1, is the importance of the term the Republic in France. But everyone in France would say they're Republican, because it doesn't mean the same thing as in the US. It means that you are committed to the French Republic. And it also means often that you're committed to the values of liberty and equality and whatever. And so there was actually a lot of people who were mad when they changed themselves to the Republicans. And I believe there was a court case trying to stop them from being able to do that.
Yeah. And so their current head of party, Eric Ciotti, which is going to be my Anglicist butchering of that name.
Whatever, the French butcher it too. It's an Italian name. It should be Ciotti.
I'm going to stand by it. So they basically decided that they would support the far right coalition with the far right should that be possible.
Yeah, basically. I think it was mainly like he supported it in principle. I mean, basically, this split the party. And the thing to understand there is, again, to go back to what I was saying earlier about how the the collapse of this two party ish system that they've had in France and everywhere in Europe for a long time, of the center right and the center left. When Macron started his project of this radical centrist thing, he basically peeled off huge portions of his former party, the Socialist Party, and the center right party. So basically, if you were a right wing, I mean, to simplify things a lot, if you're one of the right wing establishment members of the Socialist Party, which was most of the Socialist Party, they all left and joined him. And then if you were a sort of like moderate member, moderate ish, or at least a liberal conservative, maybe member of the Republicans, you also peeled off and joined him. Um, and for example, his many of his prime ministers have been from the Republican Party, or people who used to be members of that party, at least. And so this sort of devastated those two parties, and they had very little success after that, and sort of left them both sort of unclear what the point of those parties were. And that has led to the Socialist Party moving left, basically, because most of the right-wing people left the Socialist Party. That's been very controversial. There's a ton of infighting within the Socialist Party, and there's a whole wing of the party, which are called dissident socialists, who don't support this Popular Front agreement because they see the leader of that agreement, which is the France Unbowed, which is led by a man named Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's a very controversial figure, who is seen by many in the Socialist Party as too radical. And a similar sort of thing happened in the Republican Party, where they are sort of not sure what they are, what the point of the party is. I'm not sure either. And I think a lot of voters aren't sure either, which is why they've been doing so badly. And throughout, because Macron in the whole last parliamentary term didn't have a majority, he basically relied on them to support everything. And that was very controversial within the party. There was a lot of issues where a lot of people were rebelling against this because they didn't want to be held responsible by voters for pushing through extremely popular reforms. Like, what is the point of this?
I don't want to make too much of a generalization here, but I think it's fair to say that the situation has led to the Republicans standing in for a far right elite, if you will, because Macron's party pulled in a lot of the very technocratic, traditional, like neoliberal conservative into their ranks. The Republicans found themselves left with a further to the right base, but that doesn't socially or culturally identify with the National Rally, because the National Rally tends to attract a less kosher version of far right politics.
So yeah, let's talk briefly about what the National Rally is. The biggest thing to understand, obviously they're far right, obviously they're racist, etc. But the big things to understand about them, sort of like class-wise, about who votes for them, is they're rural. There are small towns. Like, there's a lot of far right people in cities, but they really don't vote for them because they're seen as uncouth, basically. I definitely agree with what you were saying about the it being like a certain type of elite doesn't want to vote for them. And they are willing to vote for someone like Eric Zemmour, who's really fallen off now. But in the last presidential election, he made a huge splash as this even further far-right candidate. I would definitely say he is much more radical than Marine Le Pen, but he is very well educated and he's very elite and he's friends and he has a show on TV and he's friends with all the media figures. So he got a massive amount of votes in the rich parts of Paris.
Yeah, and so his party was called the Reconquest.
Yeah, Jesus. What a name that is. The recon. You can imagine what they're trying to reconquer.
He always talked about the great replacement, the Islamicization of France, that kind of stuff.
Which is way cruder than like what in what he's saying is way cruder and more openly racist than what Le Pen would say. But
Absolutely.
He said it with all these like allusions to the classics and French culture.
Oh, he always cited authors.
He is. I really. if it was like if I had to vote between like Le Pen and him, I mean, I'd be slamming that Le Pen button instantly. Well, anyway. But the point is, the Parisian elite did not find him distasteful, and they do find Le Pen distasteful because, yeah, I don't know, the way she speaks. Also, she's kind of like she's very unpolished, I would say,
I
um,
agree.
and that's part of what appeals to people, right? Because I mean, we don't have time here to delve in, and we also probably don't have a great analysis on why the hell is the National Front so popular and getting increasingly popular. But definitely a big part of it. And when you look at these electoral maps, you get it where no one's voting for them in Paris, like almost no one. They haven't gotten any candidates to the second round in Paris, which is crazy. Uh, and meanwhile, they've won most of the country. It's just this resentment against the French elites, the resentment against Paris, the Parisian elites, the cultural elites, the political elites, every type of elite. Again, a very similar thing you get a lot of places, but different than the US in that in the US, like that's some of Trump's base, but Trump's base is also like a lot of elite, wealthy people in a way that I really don't think that that's true for Le Pen.
When you look at the Donald Trump phenomenon, there is a certain new world aspect about him, which is like, he might not represent my social or cultural values, but if he pushes forward my pocketbook, I can let him have the reins. Whereas I think with Marine Le Pen, there's a concern she might make us look bad abroad. She might
Yeah.
disrespect a diplomat in a way that is uncomfortable to a certain class that's committed, especially
Yeah.
to the
Which
European project.
which is also like a lot of the liberals' complaints about Trump, much more than anything to do with policy. It's just he looks bad. He's embarrassing. Similar thing, and also it's worth pointing out that Trump does actually, Trump comes from within the New York elite, right? Very much.
Yeah.
Le Pen doesn't. Not to say she's like working class by any stretch, but her father was a political parasite that everyone hated and found distasteful for like a long time. So her coming from that family definitely means that she was, as far as I know, never in these polite society circles in Paris. Now, that elite perception of her is changing, and definitely something you see in the French media this election cycle is really trying to backpedal on their fear mongering about the RN and coming more and more to like, accept her, accept them, and to try to get close to them, which is a more general trend we're seeing in Europe with especially Meloni in Italy, who was this parasite, far right parasite, who now is sort of being embraced by the European elite because they've realized, oh, we can work with this woman. Yeah, she's a bit uncouth, but she really wants the same things we do.
Yes, her slogan is the same of that of France under Vichy, Italy under fascism,
Yeah.
but I guess that's fine. Question
Yeah,
mark?
but it turns out she actually doesn't really want to change anything. She wants to be a bit more racist, and it's like, oh, well, that's not the elite's main concern. They don't necessarily love that, but the most important thing is you're not touching anything economic, and Meloni is vehemently not. And Le Pen scared people for a while, making it, doing this sort of, we could almost call like a red-brown thing, where she sort of like played up the welfare state and stuff. But they know she's not going to really do that, and so you've seen like the media getting less anti her, which is interesting. And also I've seen a lot of like them in the French media. They're saying the danger to the Republic from the RN and LFE, the Manson bout.
Yes, that is the thing. The false equivalence where you say like on one side you have people who want to like increase minimum wage or whatever, and then on the other side you have people who have like an aggressive immigration policy, and sort of the center, the Macron center, is trying to put these two political projects on the same footing essentially.
And that brings us kind of to what's happened post-election. But first,
What happened during the election?
what happened in the election, which was basically, again, because of this 2-round system, it's very hard to like make any definitive statements about what happened. But what we can say is that the National Front, the National Rally, came first with 33.1% of the votes. So that's a lot smaller percentage than Marine Le Pen got in the previous election, which was 42%. But she came first. They came first, which is the shocking headline, right? Far right coming first in France. And then after that, you have the New Popular Front, which is the Left Alliance, 28%. And then what the article I'm looking at here describes as the presidential coalition, again, because it's that's a whole other thing. We'll definitely talk about Macron, go into depth into Macron at some episode, but like his project is him,
Yeah.
right? And various people he brings in, then throws away. There's no party there. There technically is, but not really. It's the presidential coalition with 20%. And then the Republicans at a pathetic 6.7% of the vote.
So this situation requires a few caveats. First of all, as Liam just alluded to, this is just the first round. Second of all, and I think this is undeniable at this point, the presidential coalition has utterly failed to capture any popular sentiment.
Humiliating for them.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good result for the left. It's just sad that we've gotten to a point in France where this is considered a good result for the left, is getting 28% of the vote and the rest of the vote going to the right.
So what are the next steps?
Yeah, well, the next steps, this week. So it's only a week between rounds. So this week's what's happening is there's a lot of debate about what to do in the case of the aforementioned triangulars, where let's say we have a situation where, I can definitely just find this on this electoral map here and click on somewhere. Here's a great example. I just randomly clicked on a brown area, which means that it was won by the RN, which is most of the country is outside of Paris and like the west coast around Brittany, which for some reason really likes Macron. And I typed on Périgueux near Bordeaux. And there we had Nadine Luchon of the RN coming first with 38%. Second, Pascal Martin from the France Unbowed with 29%. And third, Clément Thonon with 24%, who was from the presidential coalition. That's a perfect example, right? If you go to that third round with those three candidates and you get the same result again, the far right will win. They'll get that seat, even though a majority of people voted against the far right. And so the question is, if we consider the RN to be this huge, far right threat to France, then the thing to do would be to have one of those candidates withdraw.
Ideally, the one who's not in second place, because that's clearly the more popular one.
Right. And that is exactly what happened here in Périgueux, is that Clément Thonon of the presidential majority withdrew and presumably advised people to vote for the candidate from the left. And however, that's not happening everywhere. That specific case, good on Clément Thonon for that. But here's what's happened. Basically, Mélenchon, who is the head of the New Popular Front. Well, not officially, but he's sort of the seen as probably who would be prime minister if they got a majority, which they most likely won't. But and he's the sort of the radical left, the head of the most left-wing part of that coalition, if you don't count the
minor parties.
If you don't count the minor parties, which is the France Unbowed. He announced that unequivocally, everywhere in the country, anytime that the left was in third place in a triangular, the left will withdraw and endorse the person who's against the RN. And that's a difficult thing to do, because that means that in some cases, you're endorsing the Republican. You're endorsing a right-wing candidate against the far right. And in pretty much every other case, you're going to be endorsing the hated, Macroniste candidate. But they did that. They announced that immediately. A lot of kudos to them for that. And then the question was, would Macron's coalition do the same thing? And the answer has been, well, the last I saw is that they haven't unequivocally stated that they will withdraw everywhere. They sort of like I think it was Gabriel Attal, who's the prime minister, and from that party, made a statement like immediately after the election saying something like, "We will withdraw in all cases where there is a candidate who is not a danger to the republic," or something like that, in charge. And everyone realized that what he meant by that was that they wouldn't necessarily withdraw if the candidate they would have to endorse was from the far left.
Something we've alluded to here, but we should say explicitly, is that next Sunday's election could change everything, even though it's most likely that the RN will probably have a relative majority in parliament. It is also possible for them to have an absolute majority. But even though it's less likely, it is still technically possible for the left to have a relative and even absolute majority in parliament. And it's really hard to say how that's going to turn out. I mean, I think we know what's most likely, but it's still so up in the air. So a lot of the media, I think, is jumping the gun on saying what has happened last Sunday.
Especially the foreign media, which looks at this and doesn't really understand it, which is why we're here to explain this to you. Because I'm sick of reading articles in the American and British media where they've sent someone who really doesn't understand how the French electoral system works to report on this. But we can definitely say that what is guaranteed is that Macron will not have a working majority after this,
unless his party were to make a coalition that would be unsavory, to say the least, and be quite a divergence from their rhetoric, at least.
At any rate, he won't be the largest force in parliament as he is now. And now he doesn't have a majority, but he has like a functioning thing working with the minor parties on the right. And we can say with certainty that that won't happen. He won't have that again, right? Yeah. And so then the question is, what happens after that? And I don't know. I have no idea what happens if we have a situation where there's no majority. The speculation that he could try working with the far right, despite being so anti-far right and making that this whole thing for 2017 and a lot in 2022, that he could suddenly turn around and actually realize they have a lot in common, and that they could work together. That's really, I have no idea if that'll happen. We'll see, but I think
it's a possibility. Yeah. I mean, when you look at how these parties have voted in Parliament, the RN often is backing similar policies or the same policies as the Macron government.
It definitely has more in common policy-wise with them than with the left.
And it is perfectly imaginable that they could come to an agreement on immigration.
Yeah, 100%.
That would not go so far as to be what the real far extreme of this wants, but is perfectly coherent with a immigration crackdown that the Macron government has seemed to be quite willing to put in place.
Right. And this is, again, like back in 2017 and certainly in 2002, but even in 2017, everywhere in Europe it was agreed that no one's going to work with the far right. These people are terrible, they're Nazis, whatever. That is completely broken down. Look at the Netherlands. Look at Sweden. Look at Finland. Probably what's going to happen in Germany soon. It's or Spain. It's all the center right parties everywhere, pretty much, have completely realized, oh, actually, we don't care. We're perfectly happy to work with these people because we basically agree with them. I mean, then of course he could also form some alternative coalition. I find it very difficult to believe that he will get. He could definitely try to form a everybody against the far right coalition. I find it very difficult to imagine that they would be, after everything they've said about the France Unbowed, that they would be willing to work with them, or that Mélenchon or most of the people involved in that would be willing to work with him. However, depending on how things shape up, if there's a coalition that could be formed there with the other parts, split open this popular front and take out the wishy-washy socialists and Greens, I think that's a possibility. I think if the numbers worked for that, it could definitely happen. But it seems unlikely the numbers will work for that. But again, there's no way to know. But then I think the really interesting question, Patrick, is what happens if the National Front does get a majority, and Macron is, of course, is still president. He still has 2 years left in his presidency.
So we get into the legal specifics of how this would work in episode 1, but generally, France has a kind of a strange system where you have a president, a government, so that means the prime minister and his ministers or her ministers, and then you have the National Assembly as well as the Senate, which we also cover in episode 1. But what's important to know here is that the president nominates the prime minister. However, he can only do this with Parliament's approval. So, in a case in which his party does not have a majority in Parliament, or his allies do not have a majority in Parliament, he may be forced to accept a far right or an unfriendly prime minister. Now, what are the consequences of this? Well, even though the president is historically a strong figure in the Fifth Republic in France, in modern France, all that power, or much of that power, is hamstrung the moment that there's what's called cohabitation. So this is when the prime minister is not from the same party, or at least friendly to the party that has the presidency. In that case, the prime minister becomes the key political player, and the presidency becomes a largely ceremonial role, at least on paper. And what that means is, if there is, for example, a far-right majority in the National Assembly, there is a world in which they are essentially governing the country, and the president essentially has a backseat role and mainly oversees the armed forces and like international treaties and whatnot.
Yeah, so this is, to be clear, very much a possibility. I don't think it's likely. That's my prediction. That's not going to happen. Is there's not going to be an RN majority, but it's definitely within the realms of what could happen. It's like the fun thing about French elections like this is that the polling doesn't really tell you that much because it's so down to these little differences in percentages in so many different departments that it really will hang on the balance of kind of like how this thing stupidly works in the US, where it hangs on the balance of swing states. No one uses that phrase in France, of course, but you could almost say there are swing circumscriptions, swing departments. So yeah, I mean, we'll find out on Sunday, and you better believe that whatever happens, you'll hear all about it and what to make of it here on the Royal Palace Podcast.
So as we already mentioned in episode 1, we introduced people to France, what France is, how it works, etc. So we hope you'll stay tuned for that episode coming out next week. But we also have several episodes recorded following that. And we're going to be talking about different things like tort law, how that works in France, contract law. We get into all types of different topics, and we are excited to hear from you. We're happy to cover any topics that might interest our American audience. I know I want to do an episode about how healthcare works in France or universities, because I'm sure that's one of the points that Americans might be aware of as being significantly different between how our countries work.
We hope to cover tons of topics on this podcast. All things about France, French law, French politics. Later we'll get into French history. We talked a bit about why we want to do this in episode 1, but basically it's just that it's very hard from the US to understand what's going on in other countries. Our media doesn't tell you very much about it, or gives you a very skewed and often uninformed perspective. And of course, most of the resources to actually find out about France are in French. So we hope this will be useful. Please let us know what you want to hear about. And hopefully, when you hear from us again, France will not be run by neo-fascists. But who knows? We'll find out on Sunday, and we'll all find out on Sunday. So thank you very much from the Royal Palace Podcast. I'm Liam. This is Patrick. Goodbye.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.